There's a heat dome strengthening over the western United States right now, and most people have no idea what it is actually doing behind the scenes. Yes, it is going to bring dangerous, record-breaking heat to places like Las Vegas, Phoenix, and Palm Springs over the next several days. But that is honestly the least interesting part of this story, because what this heat dome is doing to the atmosphere thousands of feet above the surface is setting off a chain reaction that is going to affect the weather for tens of millions of people, all the way from the Great Plains to the Ohio Valley over the next 5 to 7 days. And we are going to break all of it down today. So let's get right into it. First, let's talk about what a heat dome actually is. Because I think a lot of people hear that term and they kind of just imagine it as a bubble of hot air sitting over an area. And that is partially correct, but it is a lot more complicated than that. And understanding exactly how this thing works is going to make everything else in today's video make a lot more sense. A heat dome forms when a ridge of high pressure builds and strengthens in the upper atmosphere, typically around the 500 millibar level, which is roughly 18,000 feet above the surface. When that ridge is in place, it acts almost like a lid on a pot. Air from the upper atmosphere sinks down toward the surface, and as that air sinks, it compresses. And as it compresses, it warms up. And once it warms up, it prevents clouds from forming, which means the sun beats down unimpeded on the surface all day long with nothing to stop it. And then at night, the heat that built up during the day cannot escape efficiently because that same ridge keeps things locked in, so each day gets a little hotter than the last. And that is exactly what is happening right now across the interior West. The ridge we are watching has already been in place for several days, but the models are indicating that it is going to intensify significantly over the next 48 to 72 hours. Right now, the center of the ridge is positioned over the Great Basin, covering parts of Nevada, Utah, and into eastern California. As we go into tomorrow and Thursday, that ridge is expected to amplify and push northward slightly, which is going to have two very significant consequences. The first and most obvious one is the heat across the southwest and the interior west. The second and arguably more important one for the overall weather pattern across the entire country is what happens on the eastern flank of that ridge. And that is where this story really gets interesting. When you have a strong ridge of high pressure amplifying in the western United States, the atmosphere does not just sit there and do nothing on the other side of it. Atmospheric dynamics simply do not work that way. On the eastern flank of a strengthening ridge, you tend to get a trough, which is essentially the opposite of a ridge. Where a ridge is associated with sinking air and high pressure and warmth, a trough is associated with rising air and lower pressure and storm development. And right now, as this western ridge strengthens, it is going to force a trough to dig into the central United States. And that trough is going to be the engine behind a multi-day severe weather threat that is going to affect the Great Plains, the Midwest, and eventually the Ohio Valley from Thursday all the way through the weekend. So when you hear about severe thunderstorms in Nebraska on Thursday, or a possible tornado outbreak in Missouri and Arkansas on Friday, just remember that the heat dome sitting over Las Vegas is a big part of the reason why that is happening. They are connected. The atmosphere is connected. And that is something that I think gets lost a lot when individual weather events get covered in isolation. Now let's talk about the heat itself, because even though I said it is the least interesting part of the story, it is still going to be life-threatening for a lot of people over the next several days, and I do not want to gloss over that. As the ridge strengthens and pushes northward going into Thursday and Friday, we are going to see high temperatures absolutely skyrocket across portions of the desert Southwest and the interior valleys of California. Las Vegas is going to be looking at high temperatures approaching 115 degrees Fahrenheit over the next few days, which would either tie or break some daily records depending on exactly how intense this ridge gets. Phoenix is going to be in a similar situation, with daytime highs running well above 110 degrees and nighttime lows that barely drop below 90. And that is the dangerous part about heat events like this. It is not just about the daytime heat. It is about the lack of overnight recovery. When temperatures stay in the upper 80s and 90s through the overnight hours, the human body never really gets a chance to cool down. And that is when heat-related illness becomes a real and serious risk, especially for elderly residents and those who do not have access to air conditioning. Palm Springs is looking at similar conditions, potentially touching 120 degrees at some point during the peak of this event, which, if it happens, would be one of the hottest temperatures ever recorded there. And it is not just the desert Southwest that is going to be dealing with this. As the ridge pushes northward, we are also going to see above normal temperatures spreading into portions of the Pacific Northwest by the end of the week. Portland and Seattle are both looking at temperatures running 10 to 15 degrees above normal going into Saturday and Sunday, which is not quite the extreme heat event that Arizona and Nevada are dealing with, but it is still going to be uncomfortable, and it is still going to stress the power grid in those areas because air conditioning is a lot less common in the Pacific Northwest than it is in the Southwest. The other thing I want to point out about this heat event is the humidity, or more specifically, the lack of it in some areas and the presence of it in others. Across Arizona and the interior Southwest, we are actually entering what is known as monsoon season, and there has been some modest moisture getting dragged northward from the Gulf of California and from the Gulf of Mexico. And what that means is that the heat in Phoenix and Tucson is not purely a dry heat situation right now. There is enough atmospheric moisture in place that dew points are running in the 50s and even touching the lower 60s in some spots, which pushes the heat index, or the feels like temperature, several degrees above the actual air temperature. So when you hear 112 degrees in Phoenix, the feels like temperature could be closer to 118 or even higher in spots where the humidity is more elevated. That is an absolutely brutal combination, and I just want people in those areas to take this seriously. Stay hydrated, stay inside during the peak afternoon hours, and please check on your neighbors and your elderly family members. Now let's pivot and talk about what is happening on the other side of that ridge, because this is where the weather gets really complicated and really interesting over the next several days. As that western ridge amplifies, we are going to see a surface low pressure system developing across the northern and central plains by Thursday. And this surface low is going to be the focal point for severe weather over multiple days. The Storm Prediction Center already has a large marginal risk of severe weather in place stretching from Kansas City all the way back up into Minnesota for Thursday, and a more focused slight risk across Nebraska and South Dakota, where the more localized threat will be centered. For Thursday specifically, the main concern is going to be damaging straight-line winds. We are looking at a scenario where thunderstorms develop during the afternoon across the central and northern plains. And as those storms organize, the main risk is going to be a damaging wind gust threat reaching up to about 70 miles per hour in some locations. There's also going to be some large hail possible, particularly in areas where discrete supercells are able to form before everything clusters up into a more organized line of storms. And I would not rule out an isolated tornado threat, especially across Nebraska and South Dakota, if any discrete supercells manage to get going before the whole thing congeals into a squall line. But overall for Thursday, I think this is going to be a somewhat straightforward, severe weather day. Damaging winds are the main story, the tornado risk is low, and while it will not be a pleasant afternoon and evening across the northern plains, it is not the kind of setup that I would lose a lot of sleep over from a life-threatening, severe weather standpoint. Friday is an entirely different situation, and I want to spend some time on this because Friday is one of the more unusual and frankly frustrating forecasting scenarios that I have seen in a while. And the reason why is that this day has an extremely high ceiling and an extremely low floor at the same time. And those two things almost never coexist in the same forecast like this. Let me explain what I mean by that. The high ceiling scenario for Friday looks like this. That low pressure system that develops over the northern plains on Thursday continues to deepen and strengthen as it slides into the Midwest by Friday. If that happens, we are going to have a very potent upper level system interacting with a significant boundary layer moisture return from the Gulf of Mexico, and the combination of the two could produce an environment that supports all severe weather hazards, including strong and long track tornadoes across portions of Missouri, Arkansas, and potentially into Illinois. We are talking about a scenario where there is very strong directional wind shear in place, with low level winds veering sharply from southerly to southwesterly as you go up in altitude. That veering wind profile is exactly the kind of atmospheric setup that allows supercell thunderstorms to develop the rotating updrafts that can eventually produce tornadoes. And if the capping inversion, which is essentially the lid that keeps storms from firing too early, holds long enough for discrete supercells to develop in the late afternoon hours, Friday could be a significant and potentially dangerous severe weather day. Now here is where the low floor comes in. The other scenario is that all of that convection that fires during the overnight hours on Thursday and into Thursday morning essentially destabilizes the entire warm sector and prevents the environment from recharging by Friday afternoon. What that means in plain language is that if there are too many storms overnight, they basically use up all the available energy in the atmosphere. By the time Friday afternoon rolls around and you would expect the prime time for severe weather, there's just nothing left for new storms to feed on. The atmosphere is essentially exhausted. And in that scenario, Friday ends up being mostly a cloudy, rainy day across the Midwest with maybe some elevated wind gusts, but nothing really in the way of organized severe weather. The European model has been leaning toward the high ceiling scenario, showing a more robust and well-defined low pressure system moving into Iowa and Minnesota by Friday morning, and a broader area of instability stretching from Arkansas up through western Illinois. The high resolution models, on the other hand, are not nearly as aggressive. Some of them are barely showing a coherent low-pressure system at all by Friday, and they are suggesting that the overnight convection on Thursday is going to do exactly what I described. which is essentially stabilize the atmosphere and shut down any potential for significant daytime severe weather. So the honest answer here is that we do not know yet what Friday is going to look like. And I know that is not a satisfying answer. But I would rather be straight with you about the forecast uncertainty than pretend that I have this locked in when I do not. What I can tell you is that if Friday does verify closer to the European model scenario, it has the potential to be a very dangerous and memorable severe weather day across the Missouri and Arkansas corridor. And if it verifies closer to the high-resolution model scenario, it is going to be a relatively quiet and uneventful day, with some rain and some wind, but nothing that rises to the level of a significant outbreak. Saturday takes whatever happened on Friday and extends it into the Ohio Valley. The same storm system, now tracking eastward, is going to bring a severe weather threat to portions of Tennessee, Kentucky, Ohio, and West Virginia during the afternoon and evening hours on Saturday. The tornado risk on Saturday is actually going to be something to watch closely, particularly if the storm system is still organized and has not weakened too much by the time it reaches that part of the country. The Ohio Valley has a geography that can actually enhance tornado potential in certain setups, particularly when there is a strong low-level jet in place from the south, which is expected to be the case on Saturday. Wind shear values are going to be favorable for rotating storms if they can develop, and there will be enough moisture in place to support significant convection. The main wild card on Saturday, just like on Friday, is the question of whether there's going to be too much convective activity early in the day that stabilizes the environment before the prime time for severe weather arrives. This is a very common problem in the summer months, especially in July and August, when the atmosphere is just so loaded with moisture and instability that it tends to fire storms at all hours of the day, rather than waiting for the late afternoon window that produces the most organized and long-lived severe weather. And then into Sunday and Monday, the storm system is going to start to weaken as it approaches the east coast, but it could still produce some scattered showers and maybe some isolated thunderstorms from the mid-Atlantic into New England. For most of those areas, Sunday is going to feel like a significant improvement over the previous several days. But if you're planning outdoor activities along the I-95 corridor, I would still keep an eye on the forecast because there will at least be enough leftover energy in the atmosphere for some pop-up showers to develop, especially during the afternoon hours. Now, I want to talk about the flooding threat, because severe weather is only one piece of this pattern, and the rainfall that is going to come along with all of these storm systems over the next several days is going to be significant in a number of different areas. Starting with New England, there is already a slow-moving coastal low-pressure system that has been spinning showers and thunderstorms across the region, and the system is not moving very quickly at all. What that means is that the same areas are going to be getting hit with rain repeatedly over a period of several hours. And for areas that already have saturated soil from previous rainfall events, even 3 to 4 inches of additional rainfall is going to cause major flooding problems. Hartford, Connecticut, and Worcester, Massachusetts are two cities that I'm watching closely for the flooding threat. And in places where the drainage infrastructure is older and less capable of handling that kind of rainfall rate, that is going to translate directly into road closures, basement flooding, and potential water rescues. Please take this seriously if you live in these areas. Do not drive through flooded roadways. It does not take much moving water to sweep a vehicle off a road, and it is simply not worth the risk. Moving into the plains and the Midwest, the storm systems that will be rolling through from Thursday into the weekend are also going to produce significant rainfall totals in addition to the severe weather threat. The European model is pointing at widespread 1 to 4 inches of rainfall across Iowa, Illinois, and portions of Wisconsin, particularly on Friday, if the European model scenario comes to fruition with a more robust low-pressure system tracking through the region. The soil across parts of the Midwest has been running below normal on moisture in some areas after a relatively dry stretch earlier in the month, which means it can absorb some rainfall before runoff becomes a problem. But if we get into a situation where heavy thunderstorms are dropping an inch or two of rain per hour over the same location, the soil simply cannot keep up and surface flooding will develop quickly. I also want to touch on the temperature situation across the country because honestly the temperatures are going to be a bit of a silver lining for a lot of people in the Midwest and Ohio Valley over the next several days despite all of this severe weather and flooding potential. Ahead of these storm systems, a very refreshing air mass is going to be in place across the Great Lakes region and the Ohio Valley. We are looking at overnight low temperatures dropping into the 50s and even the upper 40s in some spots across northern Ohio and Michigan going into Thursday morning, which is remarkable for the end of July. Daytime high temperatures on Thursday and Friday across the Midwest are going to be running 10 to 15 degrees below normal for this time of year, generally in the lower to middle 80s in most locations. And even the feels-like temperatures, which have been brutal across much of the country over the past few weeks, are going to be very manageable. If you have been dealing with heat indices of 105 or higher recently, a day in the lower 80s with low humidity is going to feel absolutely spectacular by comparison. Enjoy it while it lasts, because the pattern does not stay this cool forever. The areas that are not going to be enjoying any relief at all are Texas, Oklahoma, and the southern plains, where that heat dome influence is going to keep temperatures extremely elevated throughout this entire period. Dallas and Oklahoma City are looking at feels-like temperatures approaching and possibly exceeding 110 degrees at the peak of the heat event, and there is very little relief in sight for those areas over the next week to 10 days. The heat dome is simply too strong and too well established over the southwest for it to budge very much in the near term, and the storm systems that are going to be bringing relief to the Midwest and Ohio Valley are going to track too far to the north to really provide any meaningful cooling across Texas or Oklahoma. So if you live in those areas, prepare for an extended period of dangerously hot conditions, and please take all the usual precautions. The big picture here is that we are in one of those periods where the weather map across the entire country is doing several different things simultaneously, and they are all connected to each other through that one feature, the western ridge. The heat dome over the southwest is cooking the western states. The trough on its eastern flank is driving storm development across the plains and Midwest. The moisture being pulled northward ahead of those systems is fueling both the severe weather potential and the flooding threat. And the air mass behind those systems is delivering a brief but very welcome dose of comfortable late summer weather to the middle of the country. This is atmospheric dynamics in action, and it is genuinely fascinating to watch, even as it creates some very real and serious weather hazards for millions of people across a very large portion of the country. The next 48 hours are going to be critical from a forecasting standpoint, particularly for pinning down what Free-to-Y is going to look like. We will know a lot more once we see how the overnight convection on Thursday sets up, and how much energy is left over in the atmosphere by Friday morning. If that convection is well organized and covers a large area overnight, the Friday severe weather risk goes down significantly. If it stays more scattered and isolated, the Friday risk goes up considerably, and we could be looking at issuing some very significant watches and warnings for portions of Missouri and Arkansas. So stay tuned, keep an eye on the channel, and we will have updated information as soon as the models give us a clearer picture of how this is going to evolve. This is the kind of forecast where things can change quickly and where the difference between a high ceiling Friday and a low floor Friday is going to come down to what happens in the overnight hours between Thursday and Friday. As always, thank you so much for watching. If you are new to the channel, make sure to subscribe so you do not miss any updates on this fast-moving and complicated weather pattern. We have a lot more to cover over the next several days, and we are going to be with you every step of the way. Stay safe out there, and we will see you in the next one. One more thing I want to address before we wrap up today, and that is the longer range picture, because a lot of people have been asking me whether this pattern is going to persist into August or whether we are going to see any kind of shift. And the honest answer is that the western ridge, while it may briefly relax slightly after this current peak event, is not going anywhere anytime soon. The overall atmospheric pattern that we have been locked into for much of July, with high pressure dominating the west and a more active storm track across the central and eastern portions of the country, is expected to continue at least through the first week of August and possibly beyond. What that means, practically speaking, is that the southwest and the interior west are probably going to be dealing with above normal temperatures for the foreseeable future. We might get brief breaks here and there as individual storm systems kick through and bring some cloud cover and an isolated shower or thunderstorm, but the heat dome keeps rebuilding and the temperatures keep climbing back up. That is just the nature of this kind of pattern once it gets locked in. For the rest of the country, the ongoing active storm track means that severe weather and flooding are going to remain elevated concerns well into August. This is not unusual for this time of year. July and August are actually some of the most active months for flash flooding across the United States, even if they are not always the most active months for tornado activity specifically. The combination of maximum atmospheric moisture, abundant daytime heating, and these periodic disturbances rotating around the periphery of the western ridge is a recipe for repeated rounds of heavy rainfall and embedded severe weather. So even after this current event winds down by early next week, I would not be surprised at all if we are back here talking about another similar setup within a week or 10 days. That is just the pattern we are in right now. I also want to take a moment to talk about the wildfire implications of this heat dome, because I think that is an element of this story that often gets underreported when all the attention goes to the severe weather threats in the east. Extremely high temperatures combined with very low relative humidity and gusty winds are creating dangerous fire weather conditions across portions of the desert southwest, the Great Basin, and into parts of the Pacific Northwest. Red flag warnings have been issued or are expected to be issued across a large portion of the western United States over the next several days. And with vegetation already in a parched and dry state after weeks of above normal temperatures, even a small ignition source can lead to rapid fire spread under these conditions. If you live in fire-prone areas of the West, now is the time to make sure your defensible space is in order, that you have an evacuation plan in place, and that you are monitoring local alerts from your county emergency management and fire departments. I know fire weather is not always the primary focus of a channel like this one, but when conditions are this extreme and this dangerous, I think it is important to at least flag it so people are aware. The bottom line for today is this. We have a western heat dome that is reaching dangerous intensity and is going to break records across the desert Southwest over the next 48 to 72 hours. That same heat dome is driving a multi-day severe weather pattern across the Great Plains and Midwest that could include a significant tornado outbreak on Friday if the atmosphere cooperates. There's also a major flooding threat developing across New England today and extending through the rest of the week, with localized rainfall totals potentially approaching or exceeding 6 inches in some areas. Temperatures across the Midwest and Ohio Valley are going to be very pleasant ahead of the storm systems, which is good news, but Texas and Oklahoma are going to stay dangerously hot throughout this entire period, and the pattern as a whole is not going to change dramatically anytime soon, meaning we are likely to see additional rounds of heat, severe weather, and flooding over the next 2 to 3 weeks at minimum. This is a very complex and evolving weather pattern, and we are going to stay on top of every piece of it for you. Make sure you are subscribed to the channel so you get notified every time we drop a new video or go live with an update. We have a full forecast update coming tomorrow morning once we have a better handle on what the overnight convection looks like and what that means for Friday's severe weather potential. Big shout out to all of our channel members and to our Velocity sponsors who make it possible for us to do this every single day. We genuinely could not do this without you, and we are grateful for every single one of you. Stay safe, stay weather aware, and we will see you in the next video.